Hey guys, tonight we slip barefoot across the cool marble floors of Constantinople's greatest jewel. You're inside the Hagia Sophia. No, not on a tourist visit, and definitely not with a camera. It's the 10th century, give or take a few incense swings. And this basilica isn't just a building, it's a divine theater. Above you, a dome floats like it's defying physics, glittering with golden mosaics that shimmer as candlelight dances in the incense-laced air. The scent is clove-heavy, with something faintly medicinal, probably frankincense, or maybe just the ghosts of 1,000 solemn prayers. You sit in the back pew, or where a pew would be, if people sat. Instead, they stand, shoulder to shoulder, murmuring their prayers in Greek, eyes trained on a priest wrapped in embroidered silk who looks like he wandered in straight from heaven's wardrobe closet. Every motion he makes is slow, deliberate, holy. When he lifts the gospel, your spine tingles, not because you're devout, yet, but because in this place, with this atmosphere, even your grumpiest inner cynic starts whispering, "What if?" Now, let's not sugarcoat this. Being holy in Byzantium wasn't a hobby. It was more like joining a lifelong reality show judged by God, the emperor, and your great aunt who knew way too much about the book of Revelations. One misstep, like accidentally favoring the wrong theological interpretation of the Holy Spirit, and boom, heresy. Social exile if you were lucky, an ecclesiastical slapdown if you weren't. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening in from your dimly lit room in Kansas or curled under a blanket in Manila, let me know your local time in the comments. It's oddly soothing to know how many of us are drifting into history from different time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, you're in Constantinople, the crown jewel of the empire, and already you feel that this place isn't just about politics or trade. It breathes religion. Piety is painted on the walls, carved into every column, and stitched into the robes of every passing noble. The line between sacred and secular is blurrier than your sleep-deprived vision. Being holy here isn't just about personal salvation, it's a civic duty. Your prayers aren't just for your soul, they're holding up the very roof of the empire. Everyone watches everyone. Did you cross yourself with the right hand? Did you fast on the correct day? Was that fish stew blessed by the right kind of monk? People noticed. Holiness wasn't internal. It was performative, but not necessarily fake, more like theater with cosmic stakes. And yet, somehow, it wasn't joyless. It was beautiful. Holiness meant candles flickering in deep alcoves, processions through echoing streets, feasts that celebrated saints you've never heard of, like that one guy who supposedly survived on nothing but chickpeas and divine light for 40 years. Historians still argue whether those stories were metaphors or, disturbingly, actual nutrition plans. But tonight, your heart slows in rhythm with the liturgy, and something seeps in. Maybe it's awe. Maybe it's just the incense. Either way, you're starting to realize, in Byzantium, holiness was more than belief. It was breath. It was the empire's heartbeat, echoing in every church bell and whispered prayer. You're not just a citizen, you're a soul in a symphony. You stand still,
trying not to look too wide-eyed as you drift toward the right side of the basilica where a small crowd has gathered. They're clustered around a wooden panel framed in silver, dimly lit by flickering oil lamps. An icon. Not just any icon. This one supposedly blinked, not metaphorically, literally. The whispers say it once wept in the presence of a particularly pious widow, then sneezed at an imperial courtier. You try not to laugh. The mood is serious, like don't get excommunicated serious. Byzantines didn't just admire icons, they venerated them. These weren't nice paintings. These were windows to the divine. More than that, they were portals, intermediaries, hotline connections. Looking into the eyes of a saintly icon was said to be like dialing God on your spiritual flip phone. You prayed through them, not to them, though, let's be honest, that line blurred more than once, especially when the icon in question was known to glow. You get closer. The face on the wooden panel is gentle, elongated in that stylized Byzantine way, eyes impossibly deep, a gold halo shimmering behind its head. Someone next to you quietly crosses themselves and whispers a plea. You can't hear it, but it sounds desperate. And it hits you. These people believe this icon can do something, intervene, heal, save. Now, sure, some of these claims stretched belief. One story tells of an icon that got so tired of being moved during a church renovation that it levitated to its preferred spot and hovered until the builders gave in. Another was rumored to whisper the names of heretics during midnight vigil. Creepy? A little. Convenient for certain bishops? Definitely. Historians still argue whether these miracle tales reflected genuine belief, political maneuvering, or a very clever priest with ventriloquism skills. Icons weren't just spiritual tools, they were political flashpoints. You remember hearing that during the iconoclast controversy, some emperors actually banned icons. Imagine telling your grandma you're throwing out her Jesus painting because of state policy. Didn't go over well. Monks revolted, women wept, and one lady allegedly bit an imperial guard for disrespecting an image of the Virgin Mary. Legend? Maybe, but it's been immortalized in a suspiciously detailed fresco. The empire eventually reversed course. Icons were brought back, paraded through the streets, and restored in every chapel like long-lost family members. Celebrations erupted. You can still see traces of it in people's eyes as they lean in close to touch the frame with their fingertips, lips brushing the wood. Not idolatry, they say. Intimacy. You're not worshiping wood. You're acknowledging the presence of the holy. And maybe, just maybe, as the candlelight flickers across the face of the painted saint, you get a strange sense that someone is watching you. Not in a creepy guardian angel with binoculars way, more like your soul's being examined, weighed, not judged exactly, but noticed. And you realize that here in Byzantium, being seen by the divine is the goal. You want that attention, that connection. And if it means believing that a painted face can cry, who are you to scoff? You start to lean in, just a little, just in case.
You're back in the heart of the city now, near the Church of the Holy Apostles, where whispers swirl thicker than the incense. A huddle of wide-eyed pilgrims chat near a small chapel off to the side, gesturing excitedly toward a locked silver reliquary guarded by two particularly alert deacons. You ease closer, pretending you totally belong there, and catch a few magic words. Fragment of the true cross. Also mentioned, a sandal of St. Andrew, the incorrupt toe of a martyr, and something that might be a drop of John the Baptist's dried tears. Ah, yes. Welcome to the glittering, goosebump-inducing world of relics. These weren't just religious keepsakes. In Byzantium, relics were holy dynamite. Each one, whether bone, garment, or mysteriously preserved organ, was considered a bridge to heaven. And not just for private devotion. No, these relics powered the empire. Literally. They were paraded through plague-stricken neighborhoods, carried into battle, used to swear oaths, and sometimes slipped beneath the foundations of new churches like divine blueprints. You follow the pilgrim's gaze to a silver casket, etched with elaborate spirals. Rumor has it the relic inside once glowed during a siege, warning the city of incoming invaders. Another story tells of a relic that bled, actual crimson drops, when a local governor tried to raise taxes too aggressively. Coincidence? Maybe. But are you going to be the one to challenge a bleeding elbow fragment of St. Polycarp? Exactly. And the relic game wasn't small potatoes. There were trading networks, black markets, even entire missions launched to retrieve them from enemy lands. Emperors collected relics like spiritual NFTs, rare, valuable, and occasionally just questionable enough to spark theological spats. One particularly ambitious ruler allegedly acquired the holy foreskin. Yes, that foreskin. We're not unpacking that. Historians still argue whether all these relics were authentic, especially given how many fingers of St. John seem to be floating around Europe at once. But in Byzantium, that wasn't the point. Relics weren't about forensic evidence. They were about presence, power, hope. When you knelt before a reliquary, you weren't thinking, carbon date this bone. You were thinking, please, make my son well, protect my village, save my soul. Some relics had dedicated chapels. Others were sealed into processional crosses, carried with military units like divine insurance policies. Soldiers believed these items could physically protect them in battle. If an arrow bounced off your helmet after the relic passed by, it wasn't luck, it was intervention. Probably accompanied by a very smug deacon. And sometimes relics were weird. One lesser-known monastery proudly displayed a holy sponge. Another guarded what they insisted was the belt of the Theotokos, Mary herself. Pilgrims wept over it. A monk once claimed the belt tightened whenever sin entered the room. Not creepy, totally comforting. You watch as a pilgrim reaches the front, presses her forehead gently to the reliquary, and whispers something you can't hear. Her shoulders sag with relief, or release. You don't ask what she said. It's not for you. Instead, you find yourself staring at that silver box, feeling a strange heat in your chest. Hope? Awe? Heartburn? Hard to say. But in a world so tied to the divine, even a tiny sliver of bone felt like a direct line to eternity. You try to catch your breath as you slip out of the ceremonial hall and into a quieter side corridor of the great palace. Your ears are still ringing with psalms and protocol. But now, in this more echoey marble hallway, something else catches your attention. Voices. Not the reverent kind. No, this is different. Heated. Rhythmic. You tiptoe closer, past a carved lintel that looks suspiciously like it's eavesdropping too, and find a small group of clergy mid-argument. Surprise! It's about the nature of Christ. Again! You settle into the shadows because this is drama. Full theological telenovela. Two priests are locked in what you could generously call a scholarly discussion, except one of them is sweating through his vestments and the other's beard is trembling with suppressed rage. At stake, whether Christ had one will or two, divine and human. You squint. You're pretty sure the room already voted on this centuries ago, but in Byzantium, theology wasn't just sacred, it was alive, and occasionally weaponized. See, in this empire, the word wasn't just written. It was debated, edited, then debated again, often with such zeal that minor doctrinal dispute could mean riots in the streets, like actual burning carts and monks throwing rocks. Once, during the Monophysite controversy, a bishop reportedly had to be smuggled out of town inside a wine barrel to avoid being lynched. Divine mystery meet ancient escape room. And don't even get started on the ecumenical councils. Imagine locking a bunch of bishops in a hall, feeding them flatbread and anxiety, and telling them they can't leave until they've solved the metaphysical nature of the Trinity. Oh, and no pressure, but the fate of Christendom and imperial policy hangs in the balance. Good luck. Historians still argue whether these fierce debates were about genuine theological convictions or just really elaborate ways to determine who got the better monastery perks. Either way, people cared. Deeply. Being right wasn't just about logic, it was about salvation. Every tiny twist of Greek grammar could shift the weight of heaven. The difference between homoousios, same essence, and homoiousios, similar essence? One Greek iota, eternal consequences. And while this might all seem exhausting, okay, it was exhausting. There was something undeniably intimate about it too. These weren't distant dogmas handed down by shadowy elites. They were lived, fought over, whispered in homes, sermonized in packed cathedrals. Even your average fishmonger could probably give a decently coherent defense of Chalcedonian Christology right between gutting mackerel and dodging imperial tax collectors. But theology also had teeth. Disagree with the wrong person, and you could find yourself exiled to a monastery in Cappadocia, or worse, made to debate again at dinner. That's right, orthodoxy could be a full-time job and your awkward family holiday topic. Still hiding in the corridor, you watch as one of the clerics sighs, makes the sign of the cross, and mutters something about divine mystery being above human reason. The tension melts slightly. Just slightly. The conversation shifts, now softer, now almost devotional. You realize these arguments, however wild they may seem, were rooted in deep love. Love for clarity, for truth, for the divine. And you? You slowly back away, heart pounding, brain spinning, and honestly, you're kind of proud of yourself for not interrupting. That's growth. By the time you emerge from the palace's theological thunderdome, you're feeling spiritually over-caffeinated. Luckily, the street just outside is quieter, dappled in late afternoon light with the faint sound of chanting rolling down from a nearby monastery. You wander toward it, drawn by the steady hum. It's calm here, peaceful, but also magnetic. Because if the emperor was God's chosen ruler, then the monks were God's emotional support crew, and in Byzantium, they had serious clout. Monks weren't just the guys who copied books and grew cucumbers. No, they were rock stars of piety. Imagine influencers, but instead of unboxing videos, they unpacked salvation. And their followers? Devoted. You pass a woman lighting a candle at the gate, lips moving fervently in prayer. She glances at the monastery's bell tower, like she's trying to get a monk's autograph in divine favor.
Inside, you find a monk sweeping the stone floor, his robe dusty, his beard epically unbothered. He looks up at you with eyes that could either bless your soul or see directly through it. You nod respectfully, feeling like a kid in the principal's office, if the principal were a semi-starving man who hadn't spoken in 3 years but could allegedly cure scabies with a prayer and a hard stare. Some monks lived in silence, others in ceaseless prayer. Some fasted so strictly they basically existed on lentils and divine love. And yes, some were known to levitate. You're not even making that up. One monk reportedly floated mid-air during prayer so frequently that his fellow brothers considered installing a ceiling rope. Practicality meets piety. You learn that monks often held sway with the imperial court, advising on policy, dreams, and when the emperor probably shouldn't invade Bulgaria. Some even had their own fan clubs. Pilgrims traveled miles just to glimpse them. And no surprise, these monasteries had PR strategies before it was cool. Miracle reports were like ancient Yelp reviews. Brother Theophanes cured my eczema and also glowed faintly. 5 stars. And then there were the hagiographies, the lives of saints. Part spiritual biography, part marketing campaign. You skim one about a monk who lived off herbs and holy visions, who once slapped a demon out of a goat. You wish you were kidding, but this goat, apparently, started attending Vespers after the exorcism. Again, historians are still trying to determine which parts were metaphor and which parts involved very confused livestock. But perhaps most fascinating is how these monks represented a kind of holy rebellion. They opted out of worldly power, but somehow ended up more influential. They said no to status and somehow gained authority. It's like declining a promotion and then getting invited to sit on the board anyway. And while modern minds might flinch at the idea of sanctity through deprivation, there's no denying the monk's aura, this soft, settled presence, like someone who's already seen the world burn and found peace on the other side. As the sun begins to dip and the bells toll for evening prayer, you wonder what it might feel like to be that rooted, that still, that quietly holy. Then a goat wanders past you. It pauses, stares, blinks. You do not ask questions.
And speaking of not asking questions, remember that guy living on top of a column? Yeah. Welcome to Stylite territory. You hear about him as you leave the monastery courtyard and wander toward the edge of the city, where a crowd has formed near a wind-swept platform. You squint. Is that a person? Yup. That's not a bird or a statue. That is a living, breathing human being perched atop a tall stone pillar, wrapped in a tattered robe, arms stretched to the heavens like a particularly devout scarecrow. This is a stylite. And yes, his whole thing is standing, or sitting, or kneeling on top of a column. For decades. On purpose. You glance at the crowd. No one seems confused. In fact, they're whispering prayers and tossing up baskets with bread and notes. One woman's weeping with joy because she swears the stylite just nodded at her in slow blessing. You're thinking more cramped neck, but let's not ruin the moment. Stylites were holy celebrities. Literal spiritual beacons raised high above the world, physically and morally. By removing themselves from earthly distractions and, bathrooms, they believed they could draw nearer to God. The logic? The farther from the earth, the closer to heaven. You're not totally convinced, but it is undeniably poetic. Also, a little drafty. The tradition started with Saint Simeon Stylites the Elder, who spent nearly 4 decades on a pillar in the Syrian wilderness. People came from miles around just to yell their confessions up to him. Someone even built a spiral staircase next to his column so messengers could deliver scrolls. Scrolls! Imagine receiving your mail by pulley system while praying away your foot cramps. His modern counterpart here in Byzantium looks weathered, like a human tree. Birds nest nearby. There's a thin rope dangling with a basket for food or possibly divine fan mail. And while you're debating whether this guy gets spiritual Wi-Fi reception up there, someone near you murmurs that he once predicted a local earthquake down to the hour. Impressive. Also mildly terrifying. But styletism wasn't just about acrobatics. It symbolized the triumph of spirit over flesh, of divine obsession over physical comfort. These figures were revered not just for their endurance, but for what that endurance represented, a total rejection of worldly vanity, which is ironic, considering they had the brand recognition of medieval influencers. One stylite reportedly received diplomatic envoys. Another weighed in on a city's legal dispute by shouting his judgment from above, "Your Honor." Indeed. Of course, historians still argue whether stylites were universally respected or occasionally viewed as divine eccentrics. Some suspect imperial officials tolerated them more out of PR value than actual theological alignment. After all, what better way to say, "We're the holiest empire around," than by pointing to a guy on a 30-foot piety pole? You watch the stylite shift ever so slightly, arms raised again, lips moving in silent prayer. The sun is setting now, casting long shadows across the city's domes and towers. You wonder how long he's been up there. You wonder if he ever gets bored. And then you wonder, would you last even an hour? A breeze brushes your cheek. Maybe it's just wind, or maybe he blessed you. You'll never really know.
You're still humming the faint outline of a chant under your breath as you meander down a narrow stone alley, when something catches your eye. A small, almost hidden church nestled between 2 dusty olive vendors. You slip in. It's dim, quiet, and smells like beeswax and secrets. At first, you think it's empty, until you notice a low wooden partition off to the side. Confession. You edge closer, mostly to eavesdrop. Don't lie, you're already spiritually side-eyeing your own motives, and you hear it, whispers. One voice is trembly, uncertain, the other calm, low, rhythmic. It's a priest, murmuring forgiveness like a lullaby. In Byzantium, confession wasn't just a spiritual tune-up, it was a full-on recalibration. Sin, after all, wasn't something you just had. It was something you leaked, like a cracked amphora. And confession, that was how you got patched back together with sacramental glue. The empire had a robust theology of sin management. There were categories: venial, mortal, oops, I didn't mean to, but yes, I said her heretic levels. Some sins required fasting. Others earned you extended timeouts from communion. But all of them required admission. Raw, exposed, uncomfortable honesty. And preferably before death, because dying unshriven, not a great Yelp review for your soul. But here's where it gets interesting. Confession wasn't always private. Oh no. In earlier centuries, it was often public. Imagine walking up to your community and saying, "Forgive me,
I covet my neighbor's goat and also forged an imperial tax scroll. Not exactly anonymous. Eventually, for the sake of dignity, and probably to cut down on goat-related drama, the practice moved into more discreet spaces, like this one. Still, privacy was relative. There are whispers that some confessors were also informants, not officially, of course, but if your sins aligned suspiciously well with known political dissent, it might just find its way to the bishop's ear, or worse, the emperor's. Was this a spiritual service, or a state-sanctioned leak wrapped in incense? Historians still argue whether Byzantine confession was a purely pastoral tool or a velvet-gloved surveillance mechanism wrapped in incense. Take the story of that one high-ranking noble who confessed to doubting the emperor's divine mandate. Oops, he ended up encouraged to retire to a monastery. For prayer, they said. And yes, there was a guard posted outside his cell for spiritual accountability. But confession could also be healing. It gave structure to the chaos of guilt. And when the priest whispered the final prayer of absolution, hands raised, heart open, it was said that your soul truly felt lighter, like it was being dusted off, rebooted. You sit in the back pew, watching as the penitent leaves, eyes red but face serene. The priest slowly folds his stole, eyes closed, lips still moving in silent intercession. You wonder what he heard. You wonder what he's carrying. And then you wonder what you'd say if you stepped behind that partition. You shake off the thought. You're just observing, right? Just a tourist in time? But as you step back into the morning light, something tugs at you. Maybe a question, a list, or maybe just the realization that, in Byzantium, holiness wasn't some abstract cloud. It was a daily audit. And confession? That was your receipt.
So you're standing there, still digesting the idea that a dehydrated thumb bone might be more spiritually connected than your entire prayer life, when someone near you lets out a tiny gasp. You turn. All eyes are now on a small wooden icon propped in the corner. There's murmuring, a nervous hush. Someone points. Is it? You squint. Yep. It's leaking. A thin, shiny trail glides down the face of a painted saint. Someone says it's myrrh. Someone else says tears. You, bless your skeptical little heart, momentarily consider condensation. But then the whisper reaches your ears. It's a miracle. Welcome to the ongoing Byzantine tension between divine wonder and extremely coincidental humidity. Now, Byzantines weren't naive. They lived in a complex world of logic, philosophy, and surprisingly advanced medical knowledge. But still, when an icon oozes oil during a fast, or a relic glows on the eve of war, you pay attention. Because in this society, miracles weren't rare. They were woven into the fabric of life. The extraordinary was expected. Holy visions could visit bakers. Demons could be rebuked by nuns with sandals. And don't get us started on spontaneous choruses of angels interrupting council meetings. You think your office Zoom is chaotic? Try scheduling around divine apparitions. But this flood of the miraculous also came with a necessary side-eye. Not every dripping icon was accepted at face value. Church authorities were meticulous about investigating claims. Well, sometimes. There were criteria: witnesses, documentation, the absence of prankster choir boys behind the altar with olive oil. And occasionally, these investigations got messy. Accusations flew. Was the miracle staged? Was the priest trying to boost pilgrim traffic? Did the icon just suffer from mold in a poorly ventilated room? Historians still argue whether Byzantine's miracles were spontaneous spiritual outbursts, highly curated propaganda, or sincere but misinterpreted phenomena. And maybe it was a mix. There's a case of a monk who claimed his shadow could heal boils. Another nun reportedly saw the Virgin Mary in a vision that instructed her to tell the emperor to stop being so full of himself. Bold move. Even bolder that he listened. Still, this environment, where the miraculous could show up on your doorstep, fostered an ever-present awareness that the veil between heaven and earth was thin. Very thin. Paper thin, really. You might be buying olives one moment and then suddenly witness the sun standing still over a church spire. The divine could crash into your Tuesday like an uninvited dinner guest with excellent lighting. The church near you starts to fill with people. Word of the icon's weeping has spread fast. You step back and watch as people enter in reverent waves, some whispering, others openly crying. A child presses his face to the icon stand and just stares. You kind of get it. Whether it's real or not, whether it's miracle or mold, something about this moment feels charged. You stand very still. You don't pray, not exactly, but you do close your eyes for a beat. Just one. Just in case the saint's still listening. And when you open them, the line has doubled.
You eventually slip away from the crowd. Miracles are beautiful, but also a little claustrophobic when everyone's elbows smell like candle wax, and you find yourself walking through a quieter quarter of the city. The streets are lined with low, worn stone houses, window boxes full of thyme and basil, and the occasional chicken doing its theological strut. And as you turn a corner, there she is, the Theotokos. Okay, not her exactly, but a massive fresco of her painted across the arched gate of a chapel. The Virgin Mary, Mother of God, Queen of Heaven, and here in Byzantium, Chief of Operations, spiritual advisor to emperors, and part-time military strategist. You stare up at the image. Her eyes are wide and soft, looking slightly to the left as if she just spotted sin creeping around the corner. She's everywhere in this city, tucked into mosaics, embroidered on altar cloths, inked into little icons carried in pockets. You'd be hard-pressed to walk 3 blocks without bumping into her serene face, metaphorically, unless you're very clumsy. In the Byzantine world, Mary wasn't just a comforting maternal presence. She was powerful. People called her the champion leader, the unburnt bush, and sometimes, no joke, she who is wider than the heavens. That last one still gives you a headache. But the devotion wasn't purely poetic. She was the protector of Constantinople. The city was literally placed under her divine patronage. And when things got dicey, plagues, sieges, questionable imperial hairstyles, the people turned to her. There's a famous story of an enemy fleet approaching the city, and the faithful carrying an icon of the Theotokos along the city walls. A storm suddenly appeared, sank the ships, and voila! Mary, military MVP. Coincidence? Divine intervention? Historians still argue whether this was atmospheric luck or a strategically timed weather report with divine branding. But it worked. Emperors credited her with victories. Generals prayed to her before battles. Citizens ran to her shrines with petitions as if she personally checked the inbox. Some even claimed she appeared in dreams to warn them of bad omens, or that her icons would mysteriously change expression if danger was near. One particularly intense account describes an icon blinking twice during a Senate meeting. No one laughed. You don't laugh when Mary blinks. Her image wasn't just inspirational, it was practical. Copies of her icons were carried into war,
sometimes literally strapped to spears. In processions, she was paraded like royalty, and yet she remained approachable. You could speak to her like a mother, ask for guidance, comfort, forgiveness. Even the most hardened soldiers were said to weep before her image on the eve of battle, because if anyone could plead your case to God, it was her. You step closer to the chapel gate. The light has shifted. For a moment, it looks like the painted gold around her is glowing, not in a miraculous way, probably just sunset, but still, it makes you stop, makes you feel noticed, protected even. A boy passes you, holding a scrap of linen. He kisses the image and presses the cloth to it, then hurries off. You wonder what he's asking for. A healing? A safe journey? Maybe just a good harvest? You'll never know. But one thing is clear. In this empire, holiness had a face, and it was hers.
The next morning, you wake to the soft clang of church bells. Early, but not annoyingly so. It's more like a melodic nudge from heaven, reminding you that time exists, and maybe you should go be holy already. The streets are quiet as you wander toward a nearby church. You're drawn in, not by curiosity this time, but by sound. Low, echoing voices, layered in a way that feels less like music and more like an ancient lullaby for the soul. You slip inside, and there it is, the divine liturgy. A cantor begins the chant, and it pours into the cavernous space like thick honey. Byzantine chant isn't catchy. It's not hummable. You won't be playing it on your commute, but it saturates. It vibrates through marble columns and into your ribs. It's chant as architecture, structured, deliberate, powerful. You stand near the back, pretending to casually observe, but you're secretly hoping no one notices how deeply this weird music is affecting you. Chanting in Byzantium wasn't just performance. It was theology with a soundtrack. The tones were designed to reflect specific moods, penitence, awe, even celestial joy. The idea was that beauty itself was a pathway to God. And honestly, it's working. You're starting to forget what day it is. A priest glides by in a brocade vestment, the color of crushed garnet. He moves with a deliberate slowness, as if each step is under divine surveillance. The congregation responds to his prayers in murmured waves. You try to mimic the motions. Cross yourself, bow slightly, try not to accidentally bless your left elbow. The homily begins, and it's not what you expect. Sure, there's scripture and some theological meat, but there's also attitude. Byzantine preachers didn't shy away from biting social commentary. One famously roasted his entire congregation for showing up to church with perfumed shoes and empty hearts. Another compared lazy aristocrats to moldy figs. Harsh, accurate. Church, you realize, was part sanctuary, part soapbox. Religious leaders didn't just preach piety. They addressed corruption, gossip, even imperial behavior. Some sermons doubled as passive-aggressive imperial memos. And in a city where everyone eavesdropped on everyone else, that meant you could walk out of church feeling spiritually refreshed and caught up on state gossip. Still, this wasn't all fire and brimstone. The liturgy itself was a carefully choreographed drama. The priest disappeared behind the iconostasis. the ornate screens separating the sanctuary from the nave, and re-emerged holding the Eucharist like a glowing secret. Incense rolled through the air in little clouds. Bells tinkled at key moments. It was spiritual ASMR with existential consequences. And the people? They weren't just passive. Even the illiterate knew when to respond, what the symbols meant, how to move in sacred rhythm. The liturgy was memorized, internalized. Holiness here was a communal effort, like a dance that only made sense when everyone moved together. You step back into the sunlight after the service ends. The world feels different now, slower, warmer. The chants still echo in your ears like someone left a bit of heaven playing in the background. You smile faintly and think, holiness wasn't just what you believed, it was what you sang. After the dust of pilgrimage settles on your sandals and the basil sprig wilts behind your ear, you wander toward a quieter district, a bit of administrative Constantinople, where robes are cleaner and everyone walks like they're late to a meeting with God. And maybe they are. You see a small stone building tucked between two larger ones, its front engraved with a careful cross and a faint inscription that reads, Office of Sacred Registries. You found the holiest filing cabinet in the empire. Step inside and you're met with a curious blend of incense and ink. Monks hunch over desks, their robes slightly singed from candle proximity, copying names onto scrolls with the solemnity of courtroom scribes. One clears his throat and reads softly from a list. Petros of Antioch. Verified miracles, 3. Sainthood proceedings, in review. Another nods, dips his quill, and continues scribbling. Welcome to Byzantium's spiritual bureaucracy, where even the road to sainthood had paperwork. In a society this obsessed with holiness, someone had to track it all. Who healed who? Which relic cried? Which stylite's shadow repelled locusts? There were registries, protocols, and probably more than one heated argument about ink color. You suspect one monk here hasn't smiled since the 7th Ecumenical Council. They record everything: births, deaths, monastic vows, ecclesiastical promotions, and most curiously, miracles. Documented, verified, cross-checked. It's like the IRS of divine phenomena. And you realize that if heaven had HR, this was probably it. You sidle up to a parchment-stacked desk and notice a ledger titled Sancti et Dubii, the Saints and the Questionables. Intriguing. One entry reads, Simeon of Lydia, allegedly fed by ravens, confirmed visions of fire, inconclusive on incorruptibility, further fasting recommended. You stifle a laugh and nearly get side-eyed by a monk who looks like he once debated a heretic into exile. But there's something impressive about all this. In Byzantium, being holy wasn't just about personal experience, it was about communal recognition. Your sanctity had to stand up in the court of public reverence and ecclesiastical process. Saints weren't simply found, they were confirmed, canonized, and sometimes debated for years, like a very slow talent show with posthumous applause. One monk tells you that the church occasionally denied canonization to those who were too ambiguous. You ask what that means. He shrugs. No miracles, too many dreams, too much goat-related prophecy. Historians still argue whether these saint-making processes were driven by genuine spiritual discernment or political convenience. After all, canonizing a local figure could draw pilgrims, and with them, money, attention, and papyrus sales. But for the faithful, that mattered less than the stories. You leave the office dazed by the sheer volume of sacred data. On the steps outside, a group of young students is reciting names from a memory scroll. Saint Nicholas, Saint Thecla, Saint Eudokia. You wonder how many names never made the final cut, how many quiet acts of holiness faded because no one was there to file them. And then you realize this bureaucracy wasn't just about control. It was about remembrance. A way to make sure that in a city full of gold, noise, and endless theological bickering, the flicker of a soul's goodness wasn't lost in the shuffle. You walk away slowly, basil still tucked behind your ear, wondering what your own entry might look like. Hwang, of nowhere in particular. Miracles pending. Decent listener. Potential.
The street's a little livelier now. Merchants shout over heaps of dates and figs. Kids chase each other with olive branches. And somewhere nearby, a donkey is loudly rethinking its life choices. You're weaving through it all, starting to feel like maybe you've got the Byzantine vibe down. Quiet reverence here, public piety there, when a voice rings out above the noise. It's sharp, sing-songy, and completely unfiltered. The emperor eats lies with honey, and you smell of yesterday's sin. You turn and see a man. Barefoot, wild-haired, dressed in layers that may have once been robes, but now look like what happens when a laundry basket explodes. He's standing on a low wall, grinning like he knows something you don't. And honestly, he probably does. This, dear listener, is a fool for Christ. No, it's not a punchline. It's an actual form of Byzantine sainthood. These holy fools, called Soloi, acted insane, deliberately, on purpose, as in bark like a dog and wear your underwear as a hat levels of public madness. But underneath the chaos, devotion, deep, raw, bizarre holiness. You watch him dance in place, alternating between prayers and insults. One moment he's quoting scripture, the next he's pretending to chase invisible pigs. People stare. A few laugh nervously. Others bow. You don't know whether to offer him food or therapy. But the thing is, Byzantines believed these fools were vessels of divine truth. By rejecting all norms, they cut through pretense. Their madness exposed real hypocrisy. One famous fool reportedly threw nuts at clergy during a procession and shouted, "You wear gold for God or for yourselves?" Brutal, accurate, also deeply awkward for everyone involved. They lived in poverty, accepted ridicule, and refused comfort. Some slept in cemeteries. Others wandered naked through marketplaces, quoting the Psalms between fits of prophetic sarcasm. One Salos entered a church during Easter, stripped, and declared, "Naked I came into this world, and naked shall I witness the resurrection." The bishop tried to have him removed. The people carried him on their shoulders instead. Historians still argue whether fools for Christ were inspired prophets, mentally ill, or skilled satirists with an unsettling spiritual gift. Some records seem to honor them with glowing reverence. Others sound more like, "We put up with him because lightning didn't strike him." But whatever their inner world, their outer one was, a lot. You glance at the fool again. He's now pretending to baptize a chicken. You kinda want to laugh. You kinda want to cry. You definitely want to know what he had for breakfast. A woman walks by and offers him bread. He accepts, then throws it at a passing noble and yells, "Feed your pride, not your belly." The noble scowls. The fool grins. And you? You realize something weirdly profound. This man, for all his chaos, is completely unafraid of judgment, of punishment, of being wrong.
And in a society so obsessed with structure, law, and spiritual formality, that kind of radical vulnerability, it might just be the holiest rebellion of all.
You're still watching the fool baptize his imaginary poultry when a trumpet blares in the distance. Not a musical flourish. This is military. You turn, and so does everyone else. There, winding through the city's main thoroughfare, is a procession. Banners flap, soldiers march in rhythm, and at the very front, hoisted high on a polished pole, is an icon of the Virgin Mary. It's not just decoration, it's strategy. In Byzantium, you didn't go into battle without the Theotokos, or at least without her best icon. You might forget your spare boots, maybe even your second in command, but the holy image? Never. It was carried into war like a living presence, sometimes kissed before each battle, other times paraded in front of the troops while priests chanted hymns loud enough to rattle anyone's nerves, demons included. You jog closer to the parade, caught in its wake. Soldiers, young and old, look up at the icon with solemn eyes. There's no swagger here, no gleam of conquest, just a weighty silence that says, "We're asking permission." The icon itself is enshrined in gold and glass, a mosaic of silver suns and embroidered cloth. Some swear this particular one cried during a siege, then glowed faintly every time a heretic approached. Coincidence? A theological prank? Historians still argue whether these responsive relics were real miracles or just very well-timed lighting. The use of icons in warfare wasn't just symbolic, it was tactical. The presence of the holy implied divine endorsement, and soldiers believed it, viscerally. Stories abound of battlefield reversals the moment an icon arrived. One account describes a general reversing his losing position by walking barefoot with an image of the Theotokos across enemy lines. The enemy fled, or tripped, possibly both. Even emperors tied icons to their own armor. Imagine going into battle wrapped in chainmail and the prayers of 3 monasteries. Sounds heavy, spiritually and literally. But the logic? Solid. If you believed that your icon could intercede with God, it wasn't just good luck, it was battlefield email with heaven CC'd. And the slogans, oh, the slogans. Forget "for honor" or "freedom." Byzantines charged into battle yelling theological catchphrases, "God wills it," through the prayers of the Theotokos, "protect us." Not exactly snappy, but undeniably earnest. You imagine the enemy soldiers blinking in confusion while being trampled by holy rhetoric. Even naval battles had icon rituals. Some ships had little shrines on board, others used relics as holy weather talismans. There's a recorded instance of a sailor tossing a saint's finger into the sea to calm a storm. It worked, maybe. Or the wind just changed direction. But no one was about to argue with the finger. You watch as the troops pass, their eyes occasionally darting to the icon as if checking it for signs. A smile? A blink? A last-minute celestial weather update? One soldier, not much older than you, catches your gaze and nods. He looks terrified and devout, like someone about to risk everything, but not alone. Because in this empire, you never marched without the saints.
The procession winds out toward the city gates, banners fluttering like sacred butterflies, and you're left in the quiet that follows. A strange hush, like Constantinople itself is holding its breath. You wander back toward your lodgings, or what counts for lodgings when you're time traveling through piety, and somewhere along the way,
you hear the faintest whisper of a story. Not spoken, dreamed. Dreams in Byzantium weren't just mental debris from too much garlic soup. They were messages, warnings, blessings, occasionally scheduling reminders from the divine. If you dreamt of a saint, that saint was probably trying to reach you. If you dreamt of a demon, well, maybe it was time to stop borrowing your neighbor's lentils without asking. You curl up in the corner of a shaded courtyard and listen to two elderly women trading tales of dreams like teenagers discussing crushes. One says she dreamt of the archangel Michael, who stood at the foot of her bed and handed her a flaming sword. She baked a commemorative honey cake the next day just to say thanks. The other describes a recurring vision of St. George chasing something uncomfortably goat-shaped around her garden. You don't ask. But these visions weren't just folklore. They were spiritually actionable intelligence. People wrote them down. Priests interpreted them. Entire policy decisions were sometimes influenced by one well-timed vision. A monk dreams the Virgin appears weeping, telling him to warn the emperor. The emperor listens, cancels a campaign, and suddenly the city avoids catastrophe. Coincidence? Providence? Historians still argue whether dreams shaped politics or whether politics conveniently adopted dreams that fit the script. Of course, the line between divine vision and bad shellfish wasn't always clear. That's why the Byzantines developed discernment manuals. Yes, really. Step-by-step guides for evaluating the spiritual origin of dreams. Did the dream leave you peaceful or agitated? Did the saint glow, or was it more of a vague shimmer? Were you given bread, or chased by frogs? All very important indicators. And then there were demons. Byzantine theology took the presence of demons extremely seriously, not as Halloween decorations, but as spiritual saboteurs. You could be tempted in your dreams, mocked, even seduced. Monks wrote about waking up sweating, convinced they had just wrestled invisible forces. One account describes a stylite being taunted by spectral snakes every night for a month. You wonder how he slept, or if he ever did. Some people train themselves to wake up the moment a demonic image appeared. Others slept with blessed icons nearby. One particularly paranoid bishop refused to sleep indoors at all, claiming that dreams stuck to walls like mildew. You admire the creativity, if not the comfort level. You lean back now, eyes closed, sunlight flickering through leaves. It's not night yet, but part of you drifts anyway, and you start to understand something Byzantines knew instinctively. The divine didn't just visit temples and towers. It whispered when you were most defenseless, most honest, asleep. And maybe, just maybe, that's when holiness listened back.
You wake up groggier than usual, still half lost in that dream where a monk handed you a basket of glowing pears and whispered, "Repent, but also hydrate." You blink at the soft morning haze settling over the city and realize something else. It's Wednesday, which means fasting again. See, in Byzantium, being holy wasn't just about believing the right things or kneeling in the right direction. It was also about eating correctly, or more accurately, not eating, at least not the fun stuff. Fasting wasn't reserved for special seasons like Lent. It was built into the weekly routine. Wednesdays and Fridays, fasting. Advent, fasting. Pre-Epiphany, fasting. Post-Ascension, surprise, you guessed it, fasting. And not your casual skip dessert fast either. We're talking no meat, no dairy, no eggs, no oil on some days. Basically, if it tasted remotely joyful, it was probably forbidden. One bishop even scolded his congregation for using almond milk too extravagantly. Yes, almond milk was a temptation before it was trendy. But it wasn't all restriction. There was rhythm. Fasting and feasting were two beats of the same heart. After every period of abstinence came a glorious celebration, liturgies bursting with chant, tables piled with stuffed grape leaves, honey cakes, roasted fish, and wine that actually didn't taste like a church roof leak. Right now, though, you're deep in the fast. You're watching a street vendor ladle out lentil stew to a small group of monks who look positively euphoric over the addition of garlic. You think about joining, but then remember the rigorous structure of the liturgical calendar. Certain foods weren't just off the menu, they were off limits to your soul. And the point wasn't suffering for suffering's sake, it was about mastering the body to elevate the spirit. You pass a woman kneeling outside a bakery, her nose twitching like she's repenting for just smelling the bread. A kid runs by chewing something suspiciously buttery. The woman sighs and crosses herself twice. You relate. The prayers that accompany the fasts are just as intense. Known as the Canon of Repentance or the Great Canon of St. Andrew, they are long, poetic, and relentlessly introspective. You kneel, you bow, you perform full-body prostrations over and over until your thighs start questioning your commitment to spiritual growth. It's the ancient Orthodox version of Leg Day. Historians still argue whether all this piety through exhaustion brought people closer to God or simply encouraged a generation of spiritually limber citizens with incredible calf strength. But in practice, it worked. The physical actions, kneeling, crossing, fasting, became prayers in motion. And even if you couldn't read or write, you felt the rhythm of holiness with every skipped meal and aching muscle. You reach a small chapel and slip inside. It's nearly empty. A candle flickers near a painted crucifix. The space smells like old stone and beeswax and something faintly vegetal, probably monk breath. You kneel. Not because someone's watching, not because you fully understand every nuance of Byzantine theology, but because somehow, in the stillness of this fast, you feel present, awake, and just hungry enough to believe that holiness might also taste like garlic lentils on the right day.
Later that week, you're leaning against a marble column, absently watching pigeons bully a piece of fig cake in the forum, when you hear the buzz of a sermon wafting out of a nearby church. Not just the content, it's the tone. You follow it like a nosy cat and slip through the back entrance just in time to catch a particularly well-robed priest throwing shade at everyone. The wealthy who sleep through matins, he intones, and the shopkeepers who gossip more than they pray. Yes, even you, Basil, with the excellent figs and terrible sense of shame, are all called to repentance. Oof! Basil shifts in his seat, clutching his fig basket like a moral life raft. You sit down, fascinated. Sermons in Byzantium weren't gentle affirmations or vague spiritual encouragements. They were, how shall we say, targeted. Church was not a safe space for your ego. It was a moral bullhorn. Priests and bishops didn't just interpret scripture. They called people out by name, by profession, occasionally by hairstyle. And they didn't stop at spiritual matters. Sermons also addressed politics, imperial policies, military blunders, and that time someone installed a new bathhouse too close to a shrine. You wonder if the emperor minded. But then remember,
The emperor had his own choir of spies who attended sermons to report on public sentiment. Church was not just a religious experience, it was a data-gathering event. Yes, dear listener, Byzantium may have invented holy surveillance. The term holy shepherd occasionally meant emperor's unofficial feedback system. Historians still argue whether this blurred the line between genuine pastoral care and low-key intelligence work. But in a world where heresy and treason often shared a thin wall, preaching doubled as public policy. You lean forward as the priest quotes the prophet Isaiah, then pivots, hard, into a scathing indictment of local corruption. His finger jabs the air like he's conducting a symphony of guilt. God sees the bribes you slip behind temple walls. God sees your false fasting and your overwatered wine. A collective squirm ripples through the pews. But here's the thing. No one walks out. They take it. Even the guy in the front row who's definitely sweating. Because deep down, everyone knows this isn't just theater. It's tradition. It's expected. It's a verbal scouring, a holy scrubbing of the soul with a loofah made of scripture and thinly veiled sarcasm. And it's effective. A few people cross themselves. A woman quietly wipes her eyes. You're moved too. Not because the sermon was gentle, but because it was true. Raw, unfiltered, uncomfortable truth is sometimes the holiest kind. You slip out before the end, half spiritually rattled, half impressed. And as you walk, you think about the other side of this dynamic, the watchers, the informants, the way piety was sometimes policed not by God, but by your neighbor with excellent hearing and questionable boundaries. But that's Byzantium, a place where holiness and power danced a slow, uneasy waltz in the public square, where every whispered prayer might echo in unexpected places, and where even your sermon seat might be a confession booth if the priest decides to improvise.
Later that evening, you find yourself wandering past a convent on the city's edge, its walls low and covered in climbing vines, the gate modest, almost shy. A young nun sweeps the stone path in front, her head bent, her pace steady. She looks peaceful, like someone who's fought her battles and picked a life of quiet. But don't let the soft sandals fool you. In Byzantium, holy women weren't just passive vessels of virtue. Some were spiritual juggernauts, theological firebrands, and occasional imperial problem solvers, wrapped in linen veils and steely resolve. You think of abbesses who ran vast convent estates with more efficiency than the emperor's tax office, of female ascetics who challenged bishops, of empresses who traded tiaras for prayer ropes, and still managed to shape the religious landscape. Inside the convent chapel, you hear a hymn rising like steam, clear, measured, haunting. It's a women's chant, the kind that lingers behind your eyes long after the sound ends. The nun who greeted you earlier beckons you quietly inside. You step over the threshold, and the air changes. It's thick with candle smoke, lavender oil, and something else: conviction. One of the most legendary holy women of Byzantium was Saint Mary of Egypt, a former courtesan turned desert-dwelling ascetic who lived in such extreme isolation that she allegedly walked across the Jordan River without so much as splashing. Another, Saint Theodosia, took on imperial soldiers, literally. She helped lead a mob against iconoclast forces and when captured, went down praying and fearless. Martyrdom by bookshelf? Bold choice. There's also the Empress Theodora, not the one with the circus background, though she's fabulous too, the one who helped restore the veneration of icons after a long period of imperial iconoclasm. She didn't just survive politics, she rewrote the script, armed with policy, prayer, and a steady hand on the theological tiller. Historians still argue whether these women were truly venerated in their own time, or if later chroniclers gave them retroactive sainthood with a side of idealized glow-up. But here's what you do know. Their names echo through these walls. Their stories are whispered in midnight vigils. Their defiance is baked into the bricks. You sit near the back of the chapel, trying to be invisible, while a group of nuns gathers at the front. One reads a passage aloud. Scripture, yes, but with commentary so sharp it could slice through granite. Her voice is low, deliberate. She's quoting Saint Syncletica, another early ascetic woman, who once said, "Just as the flame is more blown, the more it burns, so too the trials of the just make them shine brighter." You think of all the Byzantine holy men you've seen, stylites, monks, bishops, fools. But these women? They were the still water with the undertow, the candle that burned low but never wavered. And as you leave the chapel, silvering the stone path, you wonder if that's not the deepest kind of holiness. Quiet, unyielding, hidden in plain sight. The next morning, you find yourself in the courtyard of yet another church. Honestly, Byzantium has more churches than pigeons, and that's saying something. And today, there's a particular buzz in the air. People aren't just lighting candles or whispering petitions. They're excited, expectant. A man near you says, "He cured a blind child with his shadow," and another nods sullenly, adding, "He hasn't spoken in 12 years. Doesn't need to." You edge closer. At the center of it all is a small, pale man, draped in rough spun wool, seated beneath a fig tree like he just wandered out of a parable. He's not preaching. He's not blessing. He's just sitting. And yet people keep pressing toward him, touching his feet, whispering his name, holding out scraps of cloth like they're collecting droplets from a divine faucet. You stumbled upon a living saint, or at least someone halfway there. In Byzantium, sainthood wasn't a form you filled out. It was a lifetime, or occasionally a well-timed martyrdom, but generally it involved years of ascetic living, supernatural endurance, a few confirmed miracles, and ideally, dying in a way that made other people feel spiritually inadequate. And even after all that, you had to wait. The church didn't hand out halos like participation trophies. You needed a public reputation, community veneration, miracle reports, and a hagiography, basically a spiritual LinkedIn endorsed by angels. Bonus points if you had an unusual relationship with animals or ate only tree bark for decades. You hear someone behind you say, "He once survived 3 winters in a cave, eating moss and scripture." You don't ask what kind of moss, you just nod. There's a fascinating Byzantine tradition called popular canonization, where the people venerated someone long before the church made it official. Local believers would start marking the date of their death, telling their stories, asking for intercession. Before long, you've got processions, feast days, even little booths selling relics carved from the bark of the saint's favorite tree. One historian called this process holiness by committee. Another argued it was grassroots theology. Either way, the church eventually stepped in, sometimes retroactively, to formalize the sanctity. Of course, there were always a few questionable cases. One would-be saint was exposed as a tax evader who faked a vision to get out of jail. Turns out divine inspiration doesn't always look like convenient timing and unpaid fees. Still, when it was genuine,
The community could feel it. Holiness clung to certain people like perfume or static. They weren't necessarily charismatic or eloquent. They just made you want to be better. Or cry. Or maybe eat less meat and more lentils. You know, holy vibes. You watch the crowd swirl gently around the quiet man. He's still saying nothing, still just being. But somehow you get it. He's not performing. He's bearing witness to a truth you can't name but feel deep in your bones. And maybe that's what sainthood really is. Not perfection, not pyrotechnics, but presence. The kind that settles into a place and changes the way it breathes.
The next day, feeling spiritually tenderized by your brush with the living almost saint, you decide to seek out solitude, or at least fewer crowds holding babies up like miracle bait. You ask a passing merchant about quiet holy places, and he laughs, then points toward the harbor. You want silence? Take a boat, find the monks who live on rocks. Charming. So, naturally, you end up on a tiny boat, waves slapping the hull like they're annoyed, bound for one of the remote monastic islands dotting the sea. The sun's high, the sea smells like brine and old psalms, and your traveling companion, an elderly fisherman with exactly 3 teeth, offers you a fig and mutters, "They don't talk much, but the bread's decent." When you arrive, it feels like you've landed on the moon. The monastery is carved into the rock, no frills, just stone walls, narrow arches, and the faint sound of someone chopping wood with spiritual intensity. The wind here doesn't whisper, it judges. You're greeted not with words, but with a nod from a monk who gestures toward a bench. You sit. He returns to his task, probably fixing a roof tile with prayer and elbow grease. You wait. Eventually, someone brings you a piece of black bread and a cup of spring water so pure it probably has opinions on your moral choices. This is monastic life at its most distilled. Silence, simplicity, intimacy with the divine, but none of the grandeur. Here, being holy isn't about icons that weep or emperors who glow. It's about withdrawal. The great holy no thanks to power, possessions, and predictable plumbing. These islands dotted the Byzantine coastline, remote enough to escape noise, close enough to remain part of the empire's spiritual landscape. Some monks lived in tiny cells with one window and a view of infinity. Others gathered for prayer only twice a day and spent the rest of their hours farming, copying manuscripts, or meditating on sin with the same intensity you apply to overthinking text messages. But it wasn't all chill contemplation. These places were rigorous. You ate sparingly, slept little, spoke rarely. If you had a theological disagreement, you resolved it through prayer, or, if things got spicy, interpretive icon arrangement. And the isolation, not romantic. One monk recorded being so lonely he named the clouds after Old Testament prophets just to have someone to talk to. You wonder if Elijah was particularly fluffy. Historians still argue whether these remote monks were pursuing higher holiness or simply escaping the increasingly tangled web of urban religiosity. Some say they rejected empire politics. Others claim they preserved the true heart of Christian devotion, far from the incense-heavy pageantry of Constantinople. You spend a night in the guest cell. The mattress is a board, the blanket is optimism. But when the bells ring for midnight prayer and you shuffle in behind the monks, barefoot, sleepy-eyed, holding a beeswax candle, you feel something shift. There's no gold, no procession, just voices rising in quiet chant, like wind brushing water. And somehow, without spectacle, you feel closer to the holy. As you watch the flame flicker in the dim chapel, you finally understand. Here, on this wind-blasted island of stone, silence isn't emptiness. It's invitation. You return to the mainland with wind-burned cheeks and a renewed sense of inner peace, or at least, a deep craving for a chair with a backrest.
But the tranquility doesn't last. The moment your sandals hit the cobbled streets of Constantinople again, you hear shouting, angry, righteous, and distinctly theological. You glance around a column, and there they are, two monks in full verbal combat over something involving the nature of icons, divine light, and possibly a mistranslated adjective from a 3rd century sermon. A crowd gathers, coins jingle, someone's taking bets. Welcome back. You've arrived at ground zero for heresy hunting. In Byzantium, preserving orthodoxy wasn't a side project, it was a national sport. You didn't just believe in doctrine, you defended it, sometimes with actual fists. And while that sounds extreme, the stakes were enormous. One wrong teaching could ripple through the empire like spiritual malware. The church had entire departments, informal and official, dedicated to sniffing out doctrinal deviation. Some bishops became notorious for their heresy-sniffing skills. There were councils, inquests, endless letters full of passive-aggressive scripture references, and when those failed, exile. Or, for the repeat offenders, voluntary retirement to a monastery with spectacularly bad plumbing. You pass a market stall where a vendor is selling pamphlets, little folded manuscripts denouncing someone's cousin's neighbor as a crypto-monophysite, which, you learn, is not a mythical sea creature, but a theological position on Christ's nature that caused decades of unrest. You buy a copy, just in case. Some heresies were complex, debates over divine will, essence, and personhood. Others were surprisingly specific. There's a case of a monk being tried for heresy because he claimed angels didn't have wings in their true form. You know what that means? Theology got weird. The enforcement of orthodoxy wasn't always civil. There were riots, vandalized icons, the occasional punch thrown during ecumenical councils. One patriarch reportedly hurled a reliquary in frustration during a heated debate. Fortunately, the saint inside was understanding. Still, not everyone who challenged doctrine was a villain. Some were genuinely seeking clarity. Others felt the church had veered too far into politics and pageantry, and some were just really into obscure Greek prepositions. Historians still argue whether the empire's intense focus on rooting out heresy was an expression of spiritual zeal or a convenient excuse for consolidating imperial control. Maybe both. Because while heresy threatened the soul, it also threatened unity. And in an empire that considered itself divinely ordained, any crack in the theological foundation could be seen as a crack in reality itself. You keep walking, ducking into a side street where a priest is gently reprimanding a child for drawing a 3-headed angel on the wall. The Trinity is not that, he says with a sigh. The child shrugs, wipes it off with his sleeve, and starts drawing a stylite. And just like that, you're reminded theology here isn't locked in scrolls. It lives in the streets. It breathes in markets, sermons, whispers. And if you're not careful, it might just ambush you when you're reaching for your morning bread. So maybe tuck that pamphlet in your robe and play it cool.
You start your morning hoping for a low theology day, maybe just a stroll, a snack, and 0 existential debates. But the moment you hit the city's northern gate, you find a long line snaking through the street. Pilgrims. Dozens of them. Dusty, sunburned, clutching satchels full of bread crusts and hope. Pilgrimage Day. You fall in step, swept along by the murmurs and the shuffle of tired feet. Some of these folks have been walking for weeks. From Anatolia, Thrace, even far-off Italian ports. And why? Because they heard a certain monastery has a relic that cures infertility, or a saint whose icon once blinked 3 times during an eclipse, or maybe they just need something sacred they can't find at home. In Byzantium, pilgrimage wasn't just a spiritual vacation. It was a transformational ordeal. People walked through mud, dodged bandits, slept in haystacks, and dealt with the occasional miracle-induced traffic jam. And despite the danger, they kept coming, because the idea was simple. Get close to the holy, and some of that holiness might stick to you. The path is narrow, winding up a hill toward a gleaming chapel. An old woman mutters the Jesus prayer with each step. A merchant prays silently beside her, holding a pouch of coins he plans to donate. A boy limps from a festering blister, determined to offer his suffering as penance. You're trying not to trip over your own sense of awe. When you finally reach the shrine, you're greeted by a monk with eyebrows that could write sermons of their own. He nods, gestures you in. Inside, there's a dim hush, the kind that makes your breath feel too loud. A glass case holds a chipped wooden cross, allegedly carved from the same tree that gave birth to Christ's cradle. Or coffin, sources differ. People touch it, cross themselves. Some cry. One man just stands there, eyes closed, lips barely moving. You catch fragments of prayers for healing, for mercy, for a second chance. And outside, the marketplace thrives, because wherever pilgrims go, pickpockets and relic merchants follow. You pass a vendor selling authentic sandal dust from St. Basil, and another hawking miracle-stamped headscarves. Some of it's fake, most of it's aspirational. Historians still argue whether the Byzantine pilgrimage economy corrupted the purity of devotion or simply reflected the reality that holiness, like everything else, had logistics. People needed food, shelter, commemorative mugs. And let's be honest, you buy souvenirs too. But something about the experience lingers. It's not the shrine exactly. It's the effort, the shared endurance, the ache in people's legs that mirrors the ache in their hearts. You realize that for Byzantines, holiness wasn't always in the place itself, it was in the journey. The blisters, the sunburns, the whispered prayers under star-pocked skies. As you descend the hill with the crowd, someone hands you a sprig of basil, blessed, supposedly. It smells sharp and green and faintly hopeful. You tuck it behind your ear, not because you believe in magic herbs, but because sometimes you want to carry something sacred home.
A few nights later, the air shifts. You notice it in the way the wind carries the smoke from the city's oil lamps, curling, unsettled, as if something bigger is stirring. The people feel it too. They're talking softer, walking faster, crossing themselves twice where once would have sufficed. You pass a baker who mutters, "It's coming," and then immediately throws extra salt over his shoulder and feeds a crust to the nearest stray dog. You don't have to ask. You already know. It's the end of the world. Again. In Byzantium, apocalyptic anxiety wasn't a rare occurrence. It was practically seasonal. Every earthquake, eclipse, strange colored moon, or crop failure was fair game for divine warning status. And the Book of Revelation? Not just something you skimmed half asleep during liturgy. It was daily news. A theological weather report with dragons. Right now, you're walking past a public square where someone has drawn a large, crude image of the Last Judgment in charcoal. Angels trumpet over a city in flames. Demons chew on bureaucrats. Somewhere in the background, a bishop is being lightly roasted, possibly for liturgical innovation. A few people gather around the image and nod gravely. Just like the vision of the nun from Nicaea, someone says. You have questions, but no one's really in the mood for debate. Apocalypse, you realize, was never far from the Byzantine imagination. Not in a panicked bunker-building way, more like a reality check. A reminder that everything, empires, emperors, lavish feasts, marble statues, could vanish in the blink of a divine eye. All of it temporary, all of it watched.
There were real historical triggers, of course. Plagues, famines, civil wars. That one time the sun didn't shine properly for 3 days, and everyone just agreed it meant something bad. And, of course, the theological debates didn't help. Someone once claimed a controversial liturgical revision was the smoke that precedes the fire. Others swore they saw a blood-red cloud float over the city the week before the emperor sneezed and fell ill. Coincidence? Not in this worldview. Some monks even specialized in apocalyptic commentary. One of them, John the Recluse, famously predicted the end of the world would come on a Tuesday, though he refused to say which one. Others built elaborate numeric systems based on scripture, stars, and occasionally the price of fish in the forum. You wish you were exaggerating. Historians still argue whether these apocalyptic moods were driven by genuine eschatological fear or used strategically by religious leaders to reignite piety during spiritually meh periods. Either way, it worked. The more people felt the edge of time, the more they prayed, fasted, repented. You walk past a church holding an all-night vigil. Candles light every window. Inside, voices chant steadily, rising and falling like waves on a dark sea. You step in. It's warm, golden, soft. For a moment, all the fire and brimstone fades, and what's left is just longing. Not dread, because in Byzantium, the end of the world wasn't only about destruction, it was about homecoming, the veil lifting, the divine revealed. And if Judgment Day did arrive tomorrow, most people hoped it would be after morning liturgy. You know, out of respect.
The sun dips low over Constantinople, casting long shadows that seem just a little too symbolic for your comfort. You're near the Imperial District again, that slick, polished zone where guards glint, curtains swish, and no one blinks without a hierarchy diagram. You pass a plaza where statues of emperors loom, stoic, marble, and looking suspiciously like they invented both theology and multi-level marketing. But beneath the polished pomp, something lingers. It's the subtle perfume of reverence? No, stronger than that. Worship. Not the divine kind, but close. Emperor worship. The kind where everyone insists they're not calling the emperor divine. Absolutely not. Never. God forbid. But also, they just embroidered his face into a banner and processed it through town with incense and chanting. Welcome to the tightrope Byzantium walked daily. The emperor was not a god. Theologically, that line was clear. Rome did that, and Byzantium was too orthodox for such nonsense. But he was seen as God's representative on earth, God's lieutenant, God's glowing, perfumed middle manager. That meant when he acted, it carried divine weight. When he spoke, the church listened. And when he sneezed, someone probably wrote a hymn about it. There were rules. The emperor couldn't perform sacraments. He wasn't ordained. But he was anointed during coronation with oil so holy it could probably season salvation itself. The ceremony was a mix of state theater and heavenly ritual. A bishop would bless him, crowds would shout, "Axios, he is worthy." And suddenly, he wasn't just a man in gold, he was the chosen. Every public act reinforced that image. His throne room was practically a liturgical space. Guests approached barefoot, foreign dignitaries prostrated, and if you dared address him, you used language so formal that it would make your grammar teacher weep tears of reverent joy. The mosaics didn't help. You once saw one in the Hagia Sophia, Christ on a throne, hand raised in blessing, and just below him, the emperor, kneeling, arms outstretched, as if he'd just borrowed divine light and wanted to return it, slightly improved. Subtle? Not really. Historians still argue whether this almost divine aura was a genuine theological belief or a carefully orchestrated state branding campaign. Some emperors leaned in hard, issuing coins that showed them crowned by angels. Others, perhaps more modest or just politically savvy, downplayed the drama and emphasized humility. You can probably guess which coin sold better. And here's the paradox. People knew the emperor was human. They gossiped about his bad decisions. They rolled their eyes at palace intrigue. But they also needed him to be more. Because in a world balanced precariously between divine order and imperial chaos, the emperor was the glue, the glittering, perfumed, possibly anointed glue. You pause in the plaza, staring up at one of those statues. The face is idealized, no wrinkles, no doubt, just power and poise. Below it, someone has left a candle. It flickers uncertainly in the wind, but it's there. Because in Byzantium, the emperor may not have been divine, but he was close enough to borrow God's pen occasionally and sign in gold.
The next morning begins with bells. Not just one or two, but layers, chimes on chimes, like the city is slowly tuning itself to divine frequency. You follow the sound through winding alleys and rooftop shadows until you land in a sunlit square. And that's when you see it. A wall covered in frescoes, each one glittering slightly. Not from gold, but from wings. Angels. Everywhere. Not the chubby cherubs of Renaissance kitsch. These are tall, stern, majestic beings with eyes like storm clouds and feet that don't quite touch the ground. Welcome to the Byzantine celestial org chart, where angels weren't just decorations, they were personnel. In this empire, angels didn't just guard heaven, they handled business. Archangels, especially Michael and Gabriel, were essentially divine administrators. Need a message delivered? Gabriel. Need a city defended with fiery swords and hurricane winds? Michael's your guy. There's even a whole branch of theology dedicated to categorizing the angelic ranks. 9 orders, carefully arranged like a spiritual management pyramid. You've got seraphim, cherubim, thrones. Those are upper management. Then dominions, virtues, powers, middle management with a flair for cosmic enforcement. Finally, the working class, principalities, archangels, and angels. Think of it as heaven's HR, PR, and special ops divisions all rolled into one. People in Byzantium believed in angels, actively, personally. They invoked them in prayers, saw them in dreams, claimed to have met them during battles and illnesses. There's even a tale about a farmer who swore Archangel Michael helped him replant his vineyard after a flood. You raise an eyebrow, but hey, grapes don't stomp themselves. Icons of Michael were especially popular. You've seen dozens already. Always armored, always fierce, occasionally stepping on demons. A spiritual bouncer, if you will. Some icons were believed to offer protection just by being present. Others were said to glow in the dark or emit a faint bell sound when danger approached. Historians still argue whether these effects were divine, coincidental, or just an especially committed bell-ringing acolyte hiding in the rafters. But angels weren't only warriors. They were watchers, guardians, intermediaries. In some Byzantine homes, small shrines to angels were tucked into corners, decorated with herbs and small offerings. People whispered to them before sleep, asking for protection from bad dreams and even worse decisions. And while angels were widely beloved, there was also respectful fear. They weren't cute. They weren't cuddly. They were lightning in humanoid form, always half-faded into some other realm. You once heard a story about a monk who prayed for an angel to appear, and when it did, he was so overwhelmed he fled the monastery barefoot into the woods, yelling, "Too much! Too much!" It took 3 days to coax him back. You sit beneath the frescoed wall and stare up at the wings. They shimmer slightly in the morning light. Not with motion exactly, but with presence. Like the paint still remembers what it was depicting. And for the first time, you wonder if maybe you've had a guardian angel this whole time. One who's been quietly following you from icon to monastery to incense-thick alley. Probably sighing a lot.
You leave the frescoed angels behind, only to land squarely in the hum of a bustling marketplace. The sounds of barter and bread crusts fill the air, but even here, among figs and fish and people loudly arguing about the proper way to pickle turnips, holiness lurks. Because over in the corner, behind a crate of suspiciously shiny eggplants, there's a monk. He's not selling anything. He's listening. People come and go, pausing just long enough to murmur a few words, usually with the soft panic of someone trying to cram a year's worth of moral ambiguity into one breath. The monk nods. Sometimes he prays with them. Sometimes he just taps their foreheads with 2 fingers and whispers, "Stop it." Welcome to the Byzantine art of sin management. You thought confession was intense? It's part of a whole ecosystem here. Byzantines had an extraordinarily detailed moral compass. Not just murder bad, generosity good stuff. No, they had sin charts, manuals of penance, and spiritual advisors called gerontes, wise elders who doubled as emotional support monks and metaphysical accountants. Sin wasn't just about guilt, it was about imbalance, like knocking the cosmic scale off kilter. And the goal wasn't punishment, it was realignment, restoration, making sure your soul didn't start leaking weird karma into the imperial plumbing. The sins themselves? Surprisingly specific. Gossip? Definitely a sin. Talking during liturgy? Rude and spiritually dangerous. Skipping a fast day? Better hope your spiritual advisor's in a generous mood. There's even one penitential canon that outlines 80 bows for stealing someone's donkey and 100 if you enjoyed it. And don't even think about communion if you haven't confessed. Byzantines treated the Eucharist like divine dynamite. You needed to approach it with reverence, fasting, and a soul that hadn't recently punched a neighbor or cheated on fig taxes. But the beauty of it all? There was always a path back. The church didn't want perfect people. It wanted repentant ones. People who knew they'd messed up and were willing to do the work, fasting, praying, maybe donating a new incense burner or 2 to repair the breach. Some monks became known for their talent in diagnosing spiritual malaise. One could look into your eyes and say, "Too much pride." Also, "Stop talking during meals." Others were gentler, prescribing psalms like a medieval Dr. Phil. Read Psalm 50 every night, skip the goat milk, and avoid your cousin until next month. Historians still argue whether this detailed moral system was uplifting or suffocating. Was it compassionate care or institutionalized guilt? Probably a bit of both, but for many, it offered structure in a chaotic world, a framework for navigating the mystery of human failure with humility and, yes, some holy spreadsheets. You linger as the monk finishes with an elderly woman, taps her wrist, and mutters something about envy and goose stew. She smiles, bows, and walks away looking lighter. You don't approach. Not yet. But you do tuck that moment away, like a map. A reminder that in Byzantium, being holy didn't mean being spotless. It meant knowing where the stains were and learning how to wash them out, one bow at a time.
Later that week, you're sitting in a courtyard sipping watery wine from a clay cup that leaks just a little, because apparently spiritual reflection includes tetanus risk, and someone slams down a scroll next to you with a dramatic grunt. It's a soldier, red-faced, animated, and very much not talking about figs. "They called it a crusade," he mutters, "but I swear it was more sermon than strategy." You blink. Wait. Byzantine Holy War? Yes. Even in the land of incense and theological footnotes, sometimes holiness put on armor. Byzantium wasn't exactly built on conquest. It was more into preserve and pray than invade and pillage. But when it came to defending the faith, especially against enemies who dared insult icons, heresy-hugging neighbors, or unruly pagans, war could suddenly get a halo. Emperors would call on the people not just as citizens, but as spiritual soldiers. Marching orders came with fasting guidelines. And battle strategy? That often included which relic to carry and how many monks should bless your sword before the first swing. The line between military rhetoric and religious fervor blurred so thoroughly that some campaigns sounded more like pilgrimages in chainmail. One general even claimed the army's morale increased 80% after someone saw a vision of the Theotokos hovering above the barracks. You assumed that number was rounded up. In one campaign, an icon of Christ was lashed to the front of the siege tower. The story goes that the enemy arrows refused to hit it. You're not sure whether that's because of divine intervention or because the archers were too busy wondering why their enemies brought art to a sword fight. Still, there's a darker side. War, when coded in sanctity, becomes very hard to question. God wills it, after all, isn't a phrase that invites debate. Some monks openly criticize this trend, warning that too much blending of holiness and politics could rot the core of the church. Others, however, wrote hymns thanking God for decisive victories and for every enemy miraculously struck with boils. Historians still argue whether Byzantine holy wars were genuine defenses of faith or if they were politically convenient military campaigns given a quick spiritual paint job. Sometimes both, sometimes neither, and sometimes just messy. There's a bizarre chronicle that tells of a holy war launched after a town refused to accept a new bishop. Things escalated, soldiers were called in, and someone tried to bless a catapult. The bishop resigned 2 weeks later and opened a very quiet monastery. Still, the Byzantine Empire never developed quite the same crusading culture as the West. While Rome's popes gave out papal indulgences like spiritual coupons, Byzantium was more cautious, less about conquest, more about cosmic stability. The empire had enough theological drama without adding literal fires. And yet, every soldier prayed before battle. Every campaign began with liturgy. Every victory was celebrated with processions and relic kissing. Because in the Byzantine mind, war was never just about territory. It was about order, about protecting the holy from the profane, about keeping the borders of heaven and earth cleanly drawn. You take a sip from your cracked cup. It still leaks. But the wine tastes like conviction.
You wake to the sound of hammers, not the blacksmith kind, but the kind that echo with purpose. Sacred purpose. When you open your eyes and peek outside, the whole neighborhood seems to be swarming with activity. Men hauling polished marble slabs, women carrying baskets of painted tiles. A line of monks chanting as they pass wooden beams from hand to hand, like they're building a very solemn ark. You've stumbled into a church raising. It's not a small chapel either. This is a full-on basilica in progress. And in Byzantium, that meant holy architecture with a capital H. These weren't just buildings, they were divine declarations in stone and gold. Real estate for God, with surprisingly picky zoning laws. You approach the site carefully. The bishop overseeing the construction has the air of someone who's arguing with invisible angels about column symmetry. Every inch of the blueprint is layered with theological meaning. The shape of the dome, symbol of heaven.
The curve of the apse? Echo of eternity. Even the windows are positioned so that light filters through at the precise hour of vespers, like God saying, "Mood lighting? You got it." You peer through scaffolding and catch a glimpse of the inner chamber. The altar space is already lined with intricate mosaics, glass tiles that shimmer gold, blue, and that strange iridescent green that looks like beetle wings and holiness had a baby. You're told the image above the altar will be Christ Pantocrator, ruler of all, gazing down from the dome in full celestial judgment and embrace mode. And below that, the space will soon fill with the faithful, chanting, candlelight, rituals so synchronized you'd swear the floor itself hums. Because Byzantine churches weren't just places to worship, they were sacred engines, places where the divine met the daily, where architecture became prayer. There's even a superstition that the bones of saints, or at least some decently holy dust, must be buried beneath the altar to anchor the space spiritually. One legend says that if you build a church without a relic under it, the dome will fall within a year. A little extreme? Maybe, but are you going to risk it? Didn't think so. A nearby craftsman lets you hold a chunk of leftover marble. It's smooth, cold, and oddly comforting. He tells you it came from an old pagan temple, and now it's being reused, reclaimed for Christ. You nod, because, of course. In Byzantium, even stones got converted. Historians still argue whether the wealth poured into these churches was an expression of pure faith or a glittering competition between emperors, bishops, and wealthy patrons. Some churches had ceilings entirely covered in gold leaf, while others had fountains that flowed with holy water, or occasionally just regular water, but with very optimistic labeling. As the workers take a break, a young monk walks to the center of the unfinished floor, spins slowly, and murmurs, "This will be the lungs of the city." You watch him, and you understand. Because in this empire, holiness wasn't quiet. It shone. It glittered from ceilings, echoed from domes, lived in basilicas where even the light prayed. And somehow, standing among the dust and scaffolding, you feel closer to heaven than ever before.
You blink, trying to shake the shimmer of candlelight from your eyes. But the deeper you step into the palace district, the more you realize the glow never stops. It just changes source. Now it's coming from gold-threaded banners, pearl-encrusted robes, and the solid, humming presence of imperial authority. You're standing in the shadow of the emperor, not metaphorically. He's right there, maybe 10 feet away, under a baldachin that looks like heaven's pop-up tent. His crown? Less a crown, more a mobile shrine. Jeweled, heavy, and perfectly balanced, as if God's approval came with an exact measurement of sapphires. People bow, you bow, everyone bows. You're not just showing respect, you're acknowledging that this man is more than human. At least, that's the idea. The emperor, they said, ruled by the will of God, which made questioning him spiritually risky and politically dumb. A lose-lose, basically. He doesn't speak often. When he does, it's in a slow, deliberate voice you can't help but lean into. Every word carries weight. You wonder if he practices in front of a relic-laden mirror. And yet, His holiness isn't just in his wardrobe or stage presence. It's in the rituals. Coronation wasn't a political event. It was a liturgy. The emperor got anointed, just like Old Testament kings. Oil, chanting, incense, the full sensory package. The implication was clear. God didn't just permit him to rule. God chose him. And in case you were thinking, seems a bit much. Consider this. People genuinely believed the empire's success hinged on the emperor's righteousness. If he sinned, the crops might fail. If he prayed hard enough, wars could be won. Talk about pressure. Historians still argue whether the emperor's divinization was sincere belief or state-sponsored cosplay. But in the moment, none of that matters. The crowd sees a holy man, radiating divine favor like spiritual Wi-Fi. Of course, the emperor wasn't infallible. Sometimes he got dethroned, blinded, or shuffled off to a monastery. You know, classic HR solutions. But while he reigned, his word was gospel adjacent. He issued laws that sounded like scripture. He received foreign envoys who sometimes bowed so deeply they kissed the floor, just in case the emperor had any spare miracles to distribute. There's this one moment you can't forget. During a public liturgy, the emperor enters the Hagia Sophia, flanked by guards and incense bearers, and everything stops. Not just the music, not just the crowd, time. He walks beneath the mosaic of Christ Pantocrator, and for one beat, one inhale, he looks like he belongs there. Golden on golden, God's image beneath God's image. Even your inner skeptic goes a little quiet. And then a courtier sneezes loudly, and the moment breaks. The emperor doesn't flinch. He just keeps walking, otherworldly and untouched. You, meanwhile, realize something else. In Byzantium, holiness isn't just for saints, it's for statesmen. And whether you buy it or not, the empire was designed to make you feel that God was governing one anointed emperor at a time. You glance back at the icon you saw earlier, then at the imperial robes before you, and think, yeah, consistency really was their thing.
As dusk wraps Constantinople in its lavender shawl, you drift toward your favorite place in the city, a modest chapel nestled between a bakery and a wine shop, where the windows always flicker and the bells never feel rushed. You slip inside as the evening liturgy begins, and instantly you're wrapped in it. Byzantine ASMR, the soft ping of handbells, the low murmur of chant, the hush of bare feet on smooth marble. The air is thick with incense, sweet, smoky, and faintly peppery, like holiness brewed in a distant forest. You inhale and it goes straight to your chest, curling around your ribs like a warm promise. This is what they call sensory theology. Here, you don't think your way to God. You smell Him. You hear Him in layered harmony. You see Him in gold-threaded vestments and flickering halos painted high on the walls. Even the taste, when you finally receive communion, a small morsel of leavened bread steeped in wine, is a liturgical experience. Holiness in Byzantium wasn't abstract, it was immersive. The church is small, but it might as well be the universe. Every inch whispers something sacred. You notice how the candles sway slightly with each movement of air, as if the flame itself is praying. The priest emerges from behind the iconostasis, the sacred screen separating the holy from the merely curious, and his robe glimmers with embroidered crosses. He doesn't walk, he glides. Or maybe your mind's just that softened by chant at this point. And oh, the chant. It's not melody in the modern sense. It's more like vocal incense, thick, ancient, drawn from the earth and lifted slowly toward heaven. You let it wash over you. The words in Greek you don't quite understand but somehow feel. A phrase repeats, then dissolves. Another rises. The choir doesn't perform. They plead, reverently, sleepily, rapturously. You remember someone once described Byzantine liturgy as earth pretending to be heaven. And yeah, that checks out. There's an older man next to you, nodding off with his prayer rope clutched tight. A little girl watches the candles like she's waiting for them to blink. A stray cat curls near the door, utterly unconcerned with salvation. And yet, somehow, all of you are part of it. Not observers, participants. No ticket required, just a heartbeat and the faint willingness to be changed. Historians still argue whether this total sensory overload was meant to inspire genuine awe or simply keep the average peasant from daydreaming, but you can't deny it works. By the third Kyrie eleison, your shoulders have softened, your thoughts have slowed. The walls feel closer, but not in a suffocating way. More like you've been tucked in by the universe itself. And outside, the city continues. Bread still baking, guards still yawning, children still fighting over imaginary dragons. But in here, the world holds its breath. You exhale with it, slowly, reverently, and let the chant carry you like a lullaby written by the stars. The final morning comes quietly. No trumpets, no miracle reports, just a soft drizzle tapping the rooftops and a sky the color of old linen. You walk slowly through the heart of Constantinople, familiar now with every scent and sound. Bakers kneading pre-dawn dough, the jingle of tiny bells on a passing censer, the low coo of pigeons arguing over breadcrumbs with the theological seriousness of monks. There's one last stop, a hillside cemetery outside the city walls. Modest, peaceful. No fanfare here, just a grove of olive trees, a few leaning tombstones, and little niches in the walls where icons quietly watch the dust. This is where Byzantines came to rest, not just the emperors in their marble sarcophagi, but everyday souls, monks, weavers, stylites whose pillars have long since crumbled, holy women who fasted until the stars whispered their names, priests who dropped their final sermon mid-palm, and yes, even the fools who insulted emperors for fun and redemption. You run your hand along a rough stone, marked only with a cross. No name, no epitaph, just a symbol, but somehow it says enough. In Byzantium, death was not the end, it was the veil lifting. The soul, wrapped in prayers, bathed in incense, escorted by angels, if you kept your fasts and didn't sass bishops, made its journey beyond. Heaven wasn't a vague glow in the clouds. It was real, detailed, mapped out by theologians like a sacred city with gates and gardens, choirs and councils, and God seated in light so bright it made golden mosaics look like charcoal sketches. And yet, even in death, the body mattered. It was blessed, guarded, sometimes even incorrupt. People visited tombs not just to mourn, but to ask favors, healing, insight, a bit of clarity in exchange for a candle and whispered chant. You sit beneath a tree and reflect on all you've seen. Emperors crowned like demigods, monks who floated above fields of wildflowers, fools who saw more clearly than senators, icons that wept, relics that glowed, and an entire civilization that braided politics, prayer, and the occasional holy goat into one long, shimmering tapestry of belief. Historians still argue whether Byzantium's obsession with holiness
helped preserve it or quietly fractured it. But one thing is certain. Here, the sacred wasn't contained in temples. It poured through every crack in the marble, filled every silence between chanted psalms, and shimmered like light on a thurible chain. You rise slowly, dust the dew from your robe, and turn toward the city one last time. The dome of the Hagia Sophia gleams in the distance, wet with rain, but still defiant. The streets hum with new prayers, and in your heart, something strange settles. Not certainty, but presence.
And now we rest. Close your eyes, if they aren't already drifting. Let the city fade, its domes and columns softening into silhouettes. Let the chants become echoes, gentle, far away. Let the incense linger only as memory, the warmth of clove and frankincense, like a candle blown out just before dawn. You've walked through palaces and monasteries. You've stood in awe beneath golden mosaics and squinted up at stylites perched like saints in the sky. You've listened to fools speak truth, to priests chant thunder, and to nuns sing peace into the corners of forgotten chapels. The Byzantine world was complicated, glorious, and just a little dramatic. But beneath the doctrine and the icons and the heavenly paperwork, there was something simple, quiet, tender, a hunger for the divine. So, as your breath softens and your limbs loosen under the blanket, or whatever time-traveling nest you've bundled yourself into, remember, holiness wasn't always in the thunder. Sometimes it was in the stillness, the silence after the final psalm, the warm bread passed to a stranger, the faded icon on a cracked wall that still catches the sun just right. You don't need a throne room or a miracle. Just this moment, this breath, this quiet hum inside your chest. Sleep now. You've traveled far. Let the saints keep watch. Let the angels stay near. Let Byzantium flicker just beyond the edge of your dreams, golden, singing, and impossibly, impossibly soft.